It was the kind of night that made steel groan in its own bones. October 14th, 1979, the rain had been falling since dusk, sweeping across the black windows of the Millstone steelworks like 1,000 whispered no. CKS, the sky was a sheet of bruised gray, the wind carrying that bitter metallic tang from the smokestacks that never seemed to rest. In the center of it all, the number 3 furnace burned like a heart that didn't know how to stop beating. Inside the main foundry, the air was thick and wet with heat. Every clang of metal echoed off the high, soot-stained walls, the sound swallowed and sent back like a warning. 3 men, Michael Duran, William Bill Haskins, and Edward Cole, clocked in for what would be their last overnight shift. They didn't know it, of course. How could they? They were just tired men in heavy gloves, shoulders hunched under years of work, stepping into a rhythm they could do in their sleep. The rain hammered harder against the roof, rattling the thin glass panes along the catwalk. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train moaned as it cut through the valley. Down on the floor, the glow from the furnace painted their faces in flickers of gold and blood red. Michael wiped his brow with the back of his hand, glancing toward the massive feed chute. Bill muttered something about the weather slowing the trucks. Ed just kept walking toward the far end of the hall, where shadows seemed to cling to the machinery. It would be nearly 3 days before anyone realized they were gone. In that time, the furnace never stopped, not once. And when it did, years later, the heat inside would still tell a story no one wanted to hear. Before the night of the storm, they were ordinary men in an unforgiving trade. Michael Duran was 38, a father of 2, the kind of man who carried his lunch in the same dented metal box his father had used before him. His wife Anne said he whistled without realizing it, soft, tuneless notes whenever he was fixing something in the garage. Bill Haskins was older, in his mid-40s, a lifelong bachelor with a taste for old country records and Saturday fishing trips at Lake Elm. He was quick with a joke, slow to lose his temper, and had a knack for coaxing stubborn machinery back to life. And then there was Ed Cole, just 27, a quiet newcomer who had moved from Ohio looking for steady work. He didn't talk much about his past, but he always stayed late to help clean the floors, and more than once he'd been seen sketching shapes on scrap paper during his breaks, strange, angular designs no one quite understood. The steel mill was more than their job. It was the spine of Millstone, a town whose heartbeat pulsed in time with the hiss of steam and the roll of molten metal. On paydays, the diner at the corner of Main Street stayed open until midnight, serving pie and black coffee to men still smelling faintly of smoke and oil. Kids grew up knowing the shift sirens better than church bells. Summers were marked by barbecues in the park, winters by the plume of white exhaust rising from the mill's chimneys against the pale sky. In the weeks before their disappearance, nothing seemed out of place. Michael coached his son's little league game and brought home a box of donuts on Sunday morning. Bill was seen at the hardware store, chatting about fixing his old truck. Ed kept to himself, though one coworker, Pete Larson, remembered catching him staring at the number 3 furnace during lunch break, as if lost in thought. When Pete asked what he was looking at, Ed simply said, "It's hotter than it should be," then changed the subject. On October mornings, the mill floor smelled of damp coal dust, and the frost outside turned the yard into a glittering sheet of white. The 3 men were creatures of habit, boots in the same locker spots, gloves hanging from the same hooks, coffee in the same chipped mugs by the break room window. To anyone watching, they were just men moving through the patterns of a life they knew by heart. And maybe that was why no one noticed the small changes. Bill smoking alone by the chain-link fence instead of joking with the others, Michael locking his toolbox after every shift, or Ed walking home a different route through the back streets. Small things, forgettable things. The kind that only matter when it's already too late. It started as whispers on the floor, snatches of talk between the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam. 2 weeks before the storm, Bill was seen arguing with a foreman near the loading bay, his voice sharp enough to turn heads. No one knew what it was about, but afterward he stopped hanging around in the break room and kept to himself, eyes fixed on the ground when others paw. Said Michael, usually steady as bedrock, began coming home later than usual. Anne mentioned he'd sit in his truck for long stretches before walking inside, staring at nothing. When she asked, he only said work was complicated lately. Ed grew jumpier by the day, jerking at sudden noises, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. The mill itself felt different, too. Strange deliveries arrived late at night, unmarked crates wheeled into sections marked maintenance only. The older workers joked about ghosts in the rafters, but their laughter didn't hide the unease. One afternoon, Pete Larson swore he saw a red warning light flicker on the number 3 furnace control panel, the kind that meant temperatures were piking beyond safe limits, but when he mentioned it to a supervisor, he was told it was just a glitch and to mind his own business. Then came the smell, not the usual scorched metal tang, but something heavier, almost sweet, that clung to your clothes long after you left. It was strongest near the sealed side door of the furnace hall, a door no one was supposed to use, locked with a chain thick as a man's wrist. Ed passed it once on his way to the storage bins, and later in the break room he muttered under his breath, "That door shouldn't be hot." No one asked him to explain. Even the air in the yard seemed to hum with a low, restless vibration, like the whole place was holding its breath. At night the glow from the main stack burned brighter, too bright, sending an angry red wash across the rooftops of Millstone. Some of the men said it was nothing but production ramping up before the winter contracts. Others, the quieter ones, just shook their heads and kept working. None of them knew it yet, but the mill was already telling them something was coming, something they wouldn't be able to stop. The night of October 14th was colder than it had any right to be. The rain had been steady since dusk, thin needles slicing through the glare of the yard lights, by 11:45 p.m. The plant was a cathedral of noise, metal screaming against metal, chains clattering, the low animal roar of the number 3 furnace. Michael Duran was last seen walking down the length of the foundry floor, his silhouette swallowed in the orange haze rising from the molten pit. Bill Haskins followed a few steps behind, his helmet lamp bobbing in the dark like a firefly. Ed Cole had already been spotted earlier, near the sealed side door, running his gloved hand along the chain as if testing its weight. The foreman on duty, Harold Pike, said later that the 3 men had been assigned to check the slag channels and adjust the feed chute. It was a routine job, one they'd done dozens of times before. But something about the way they moved caught his eye, no banter, no nods of recognition, just a quiet, almost deliberate march toward the furnace hall. Pike remembered the smell too, that strange sweetness hanging heavy in the air, thick enough to taste, at 12:03 a.m. The yard clock told the hour, its chime muffled by the rain. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw them alive. The furnace rumbled deep in its belly, the molten heart glowing brighter, almost angry. Steam hissed from a ruptured pipe near the east wall, wrapping the men in ghost-white tendrils as they disappeared into the hall's far shadows. Somewhere overhead, the catwalk groaned under its own weight, droplets falling through the slats to sizzle on the steel below. A few minutes later, a worker named Samuel Ortiz swore he heard a sound, one sharp, metallic crack, followed by what he described as a rush of heat. Ike, someone opened a door to a different world, but when he looked toward the source there was nothing. Just the shifting glare of the furnace and the empty stretch of floor. No one noticed their absence right away. The shift was long and the furnace demanded constant attention, but by 3 a.m. when the feed numbers didn't add up and their tools were found resting neatly on a side bench, the truth began to seep in. The rain kept falling. The furnace kept burning. And the place where the 3 men had stood was nothing but an empty, glowing corridor, waiting for someone to step forward and ask the question no one wanted to ask. By dawn, word had already reached the mill superintendent's office, 3 men gone. No one had seen them leave, no one had heard a fight or a fall, and yet their stations stood empty as the furnace roared on. The first search began almost immediately, led by a mix of plant security, a few local police officers, and volunteers from the night shift who refuse. D to clock out, flashlights bobbed in the dim foundry light, beams cutting through steam and shadow. The rain had turned the yard into a slick field of mud, and every step felt like a slow drag toward nothing. The main floor was combed first, beneath the loading cranes along the slag pits behind the heavy rollers. Men called their names over the hum of machinery, their voices swallowed by the ceaseless throb of the furnace. In the furnace hall, the heat was nearly unbearable. The searchers could only stay inside for minutes at a time before their skin prickled with warning. Even through thick gloves, the railings burned like a brand. Somewhere near the base of the number 3 furnace, a puddle of water hissed and danced on the floor, vanishing as soon as it touched the steel. The catwalks were next. 2 officers and a mill worker named Grant Miller climbed the rusted stairs, their boots ringing out on the grates. They found nothing but a lone wrench, its handle warped as if it had been left too close to the molten core. The locker rooms were empty, the showers still dripping from use hours earlier. Their work clothes hung untouched, boots lined neatly in pairs as though the men had simply stepped out for a moment. Outside, the search spread to the loading bay and the rail spur that fed the plant. The police dogs whined and pulled against their handlers, but once they neared the sealed side door of the furnace hall, they froze. One of the handlers, a man named Russell Kane, later said the dogs refused to move forward, tails low, ears back as if something on the other side of. That chain door made the air too heavy to breathe. Rumors began forming even before the first day ended. Some said they'd slipped into the slag pit, a slow, searing death no one could stop. Others whispered about debts, about men disappearing to start new lives far from Millstone. But to the families gathered at the gate, shivering in the cold rain, those stories meant nothing. All they knew was that the men who'd kissed them goodbye before their shift had vanished into the heart of the mill, and the search, for all its urgency, had found nothing but echoes and heat. By the end of the first week, the search had become a cycle of false starts and dead ends. Every lead, every hint of progress, dissolved into the same heavy silence that had hung over the mill since that night. Detectives from the county came in with clipboards and questions, pacing the echoing floors in their polished shoes, but the plant seemed to swallow their efforts whole. They brought in specialists to inspect the slag pits, even lowered cameras into the narrow runoff channels, but all they found was black water swirling over rusted steel. The furnace hall remained the most dangerous place to search. Temperatures inside hovered high enough to warp tools left too close for too long. No one could get near the molten core without protective suits, and even then the heat pressed against the skin like a living thing, warning them away. Why some of the older men muttered that the mill didn't want to give them back, that the place itself had claimed them. It was the kind of talk investigators ignored, but it clung to the air like smoke. Tension in the town grew. The union demanded answers, threatening to walk out if the company kept its records sealed. The plant's management released statements that were as thin as the paper they were printed on, all talk of cooperation and safety reviews, but no concrete explanation. Families of the missing men began holding vigils at the mill gates, candles flickering against the cold wind. Children huddled under umbrellas while their mothers stood silent, watching the steam rise from the chimneys as if searching for a sign. The police tried to expand their search beyond the mill grounds. They questioned train operators, truck drivers, anyone who might have seen the men after midnight on the 14th. A lead came in from a man who swore he'd seen 3 figures walking along the rail line toward the river, but when officers followed the path, they found nothing but wet gravel and a few cigarette butts too old to be connected. Another rumor claimed that a storage building near the far fence had been padlocked from the outside the morning after the disappearance. The lock was cut, the building opened. It was empty but for a layer of coal dust and the echo of boots on concrete. By the second week, the search had thinned. Fewer officers showed up each day. Volunteers had to be coaxed into returning. The mill's schedule tightened again, the work resuming around the same furnace that had glowed so bright the night they vanished. And so the noise returned, the pounding, the grinding, the hiss of molten metal, until the sound of the search itself was drowned, leaving only the foamy lies still waiting at the gates, refusing to let their questions fade into the noise. I woke up the next morning to the sound of rain tapping gently against the windows, the kind of soft, steady rhythm that made it hard to tell where night had ended and the day had begun. The air in the house was cool, carrying that faint smell of damp earth drifting in from outside. I wrapped my robe tighter around me and padded into the kitchen, half expecting to see everything exactly as I'd left it, quiet, ordinary. But the note was still there on the counter, exactly where I'd placed it the night before. I hadn't touched it since, yet something about it felt heavier now, like it had gathered weight overnight. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood there staring at the folded paper, the steam from the mug curling between us like a curtain. Part of me wanted to throw it away without reading it again, to pretend it was nothing. Another part, stronger, needed to keep looking at it as though the answers might change if I stared long enough. Around mid-morning, the phone rang. It was Margaret from down the street. She spoke quickly, her voice hushed, telling me she'd seen a man standing across from my house the previous evening. She said he'd been there for quite a while, not moving, just watching. I asked her what he looked like, but her description was vague, tall, wearing a dark coat, maybe a hat. The rain was picking up outside, blurring the world into a watercolor of grays, and for some reason I didn't tell her about the note. I carried the phone into the living room and stood near the window, my fingers brushing the edge of the curtain. The street was empty now. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A flash of memory came back to me from years ago when I was about 12, standing in the woods behind my grandparents' house and feeling without that someone was nearby. That same electric tension was in the air now, prickling at the back of my neck. I decided to step outside. The rain soaked through my slippers almost instantly, but I didn't care. I walked down the porch steps and onto the driveway, scanning both directions of the street. Everything was still, too still. A black sedan I didn't recognize was parked half a block down, its windows dark, rain streaking across the glass. I froze, listening, and for a second I thought I saw movement inside. When I finally went back in, I found myself locking the door twice and checking the windows, something I hadn't done in years. The note remained on the counter, untouched. I thought about calling someone, maybe the police, but what would I even say? That a neighbor saw someone outside, that a car was parked down the street, that there was a folded piece of paper I couldn't bring myself to throw it all felt too thin, too fragile, like if I spoke it out loud, the whole thing might crumble. The rest of the day passed in fragments, rain on glass, the ticking of the clock, the way the house seemed to creak in unfamiliar places. By evening, I had convinced myself that nothing was going to happen. Still, when I turned off the lights that night, I left the hall lamp on. Not because I was afraid, I told myself, just because the shadows felt heavier than they should. By the next morning, the air felt heavier, as if the walls of the house had been holding their breath all night. I sat at the small kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling between my hands, while the sound of rain tapped steadily against the window. The journal lay open in front of me, the last entry staring up like an unfinished sentence. There was no date, no conclusion. Just a line that trailed off mid-word, as though whoever had been writing had been interrupted. I kept thinking about the old man I'd met the week before, Mr. Harris, the one who had said he remembered the boy from the docks. He looked at me with that mix of pity and warning, but when I'd asked for details, he'd clammed up, muttering something about things better left in the past. Now, with this abrupt ending in the journal, I felt like the past was clawing its way back whether we wanted it or not. The rain softened into a mist, and I decided I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed my coat, stuffed the journal into my bag, and headed out toward the eastern edge of town. That was where the docks used to be, before the war reshaped the coastline. Now it was just a stretch of weather-beaten buildings, some collapsed, others hanging on by stubborn beams and rusted nails. Halfway down the cracked boardwalk, I noticed a figure in the distance. He was standing perfectly still, facing the water, as if he were waiting for something to rise out of it. The closer I got, the more details came into focus: gray coat, hunched shoulders, hands deep in his pockets. I called out, my voice sharp in the still air, but he didn't move. When I reached him, I saw it was Mr. Harris. This man was younger, maybe in his 40s, with a face drawn tight by years of sun and worry. He turned slowly, eyes flicking to the bag at my side. His gaze lingered there just a moment too long. "You've been reading it," he said quietly, not as a question but a fact. I froze. "The journal?" "How do you?" He cut me off with a slow shake of his head. "If you've read it, you know enough to understand that it doesn't end on paper, it ends here." He gestured toward the water, the gray expanse shifting under the low clouds. I wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his tone told me the answer wouldn't come in words. And before I could speak again, he turned and began walking toward a narrow path that disappeared behind the warehouses. He didn't look back, but every few steps I caught the faintest sound, like metal scraping against metal carried on the damp wind. I followed. Not because I trusted him, but because the silence of the journal's last line had left me no choice. The next morning, I woke before the sun had fully crested the horizon, the faint gray light spilling across the kitchen floor in thin, uneven streaks. My hands lingered on the rim of my coffee mug, the steam curling up into my face as if trying to nudge me out of the fog in my head. I had hardly slept, turning over the same questions again and again, the ones that had been clawing at me ever since the discovery in the woods. I kept telling myself I should let it go. People vanish every day and not every story is mine to solve. But something about this, about the way it had been buried, the way the truth seemed to recoil when you got too close, felt wrong in a way I couldn't jew. Sent ignore. Around mid-morning, I drove out to the far edge of town, where the houses gave way to stretches of empty fields and broken fences. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of earth after last night's rain. I parked by a rusting cattle gate and waited. I didn't have to wait long. A dark blue pickup pulled up behind me, its tires crunching on the gravel. Caleb stepped out, his expression unreadable, hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket. "You really want to see it for yourself?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He led me down a narrow, overgrown path that wound between clusters of tangled briars and crooked trees. The ground was soft, each step sinking slightly. My heart was pounding, not from the walk but from the weight of what I knew might be ahead. When we reached the clearing, it was exactly as he'd described, a shallow depression in the earth, half hidden by fallen leaves. The soil looked different here, darker, looser. I crouched down, brushing away debris with my fingertips, feeling the damp cold bite at my skin. "This isn't just some animal burrow," I whispered. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I told you there's more under there. I found something." Didn't want to dig deeper alone. The silence between us stretched thick and heavy. I could hear the distant hum of a highway, the caw of a lone crow overhead, the faint creak of branches shifting in the breeze. I wanted to reach for the small spade I'd brought to uncover whatever truth was lying just beneath the surface, but a part of me hesitated. Once we unearthed it, there'd be no going back. Caleb glanced at me. "You sure about this?" I swallowed hard, my fingers curling tighter around the handle of the spade. The answer came out steadier than I felt. "Yes, show me where to start. If you want, I can move straight into writing part 10, so the momentum of this moment isn't lost." The sun was low when I finally stepped outside, the evening air wrapping around me like something both familiar and foreign. The house felt empty now. No whispers from the hallway, no quiet creak of a door opening somewhere down the corridor, just silence. I closed the porch door behind me, listening to the dull click of the latch, and for the first time in months, it didn't make me flinch. Across the yard, the grass swayed lazily in the wind, bending in a rhythm that felt almost human. I took the path toward the old maple, its roots thick and gnarled under the dirt, the place where so much had begun and in a way ended. My hand brushed its trunk. The bark was rough, catching on my skin, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. I could almost hear voices here, like faint echoes of a conversation I wasn't part of anymore. A car passed on the road beyond the fence, the sound breaking the spell. I turned back to the house, the windows catching the fading light, each pane holding a pale reflection of the sky. Inside those walls, there were still pieces of the story left behind, an old photograph in the kitchen drawer, the chipped mug no one ever threw away. The faint scent of someone who hadn't been here in years. I stood there longer than I meant to, until the last sliver of daylight slipped below the trees. In the dimness, the world felt softer, like it had forgiven me for holding on too tightly. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my chest, and walked back toward the door. When I reached the steps, I hesitated. Not because I was afraid of going back inside, but because I finally understood that it didn't matter if I did or didn't. The weight I'd been carrying had shifted. I wasn't the same person who had clung to every unanswered question, who had replayed every detail until it blurred. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of rain from somewhere far off. I smiled, just a small, quiet thing, and stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me. This time, the silence didn't feel empty, it felt like space. And for the first time, I was ready to live in it. Some stories never truly end. They leave threads hanging, questions whispering in the back of your mind long after the last word is spoken. Maybe that's what makes them unforgettable, the way they blur the line between past and present, between truth and shadow. What happened here will stay etched in the lives of those who lived it, and perhaps in yours too. If this story pulled you in, if it made you lean closer and wonder what might be hiding just out of sight, then don't let it be the last. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter we uncover. Share this with someone who loves a mystery as much as you do, and tell us in the comments what you think really happened. Your theory might just be the key that unlocks the truth.